Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. I am Mary Talbot, a retired teacher from Houston. I sold my little house and emptied my savings to pay $68,000 of my son's debt, believing love would be enough. But weeks later, my daughter-in-law looked straight at me and said this was no longer my home as she changed the locks. They thought I was powerless, forgotten, just a shadow. What they never imagined was that the lien and the deed carried my name, and the truth on those papers gave me back everything they tried to take. I was pulled out of sleep by the shrill ring of the phone on my nightstand. My room was dark and heavy with the silence of midnight, the clock glowing 12:30 a.m. in faint red numbers. For a moment I thought I was dreaming, but the ringing kept tearing through. I fumbled for the receiver, my heart already uneasy. On the other end came the voice of my only son, David. It was not the confident 34-year-old man who worked in real estate, but the shaky voice of a frightened boy. His words tumbled over each other. "Mom, I am in trouble. Please, please, do not hang up." I sat up straight in bed, my chest tightening. "Tell me what is going on." He was sobbing. "I made some bad choices. The housing deal I invested in collapsed, and then I borrowed more money to try to make it back in crypto. I thought I could turn it around, but everything crashed." His breathing was ragged. "Now I owe $68,000. If I do not pay it this week, they will take the house." The word house landed heavy. His home in the suburbs of Houston, the place where he lived with his wife Lena and their daughter Ella, would be gone. My throat was dry. $68,000. I could see the chipped dresser in my own modest room, the old family photos, the crocheted blanket folded neatly at the foot of my bed. My savings and small pension could barely stretch across the years ahead. I had nothing close to that amount. David was still talking fast and desperate. "If Lena finds out the full amount, she will leave me. I swear I cannot face her. I cannot breathe when I think about it." I pressed the phone harder to my ear. Memories of David as a little boy flickered in my mind. The toddler clinging to my hand on his first day of school, the teenager waving in his wrinkled gown at high school graduation, the young man hugging me when he got his real estate license. He had always been so full of life sometimes, reckless, always sure that the world would bend for him. Now his voice trembled like he was standing at the edge of a cliff. "Please, Mom, I do not know who else to call. You are all I have. If you do not help me, I will lose everything." I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. My heart was beating louder than his words. I wanted to tell him no, to remind him that he was an adult and that I had spent decades carrying burdens alone. But the sound of him crying cut through every defense I had. I whispered, "How much exactly?" He swallowed hard. 68,000. His voice cracked as if saying the number out loud made it real. I stayed silent. The weight of the figure pressed down on me. My entire world barely added up to that. My pension check, my savings, the little house I had worked so hard to keep after my husband died. All of it together was worth just about that amount. "Mom," he begged, "if you do not help me, I swear I cannot go on." Tears stung my eyes, though I tried to blink them back. I stared at the photograph of him on the nightstand, taken on the day he bought his first car. His grin had been so wide, his arm slung proudly across my shoulder. He had looked like a man who could take on the world. Now he was pleading like a boy cornered. I wanted to scream at him to tell him he had been foolish and selfish. But I also remembered the nights I rocked him to sleep with nothing but an old fan humming in the background. I remembered mopping motel floors with him as a teenager when we were short on rent. He had been mine to protect since the moment I first held him. He was still crying. I owe people real money. They are coming for the house. If I lose it, I lose Lena. I lose Ella. I will have nothing left. I closed my eyes and let out a long breath. The silence between us stretched, filled only with his gasps. In that silence, I could feel the full weight of motherhood pressing on me, the unshakable truth that no matter how old he became, he was still my child. I finally said I will think about it in the morning. But even as I spoke the words, I knew there would be no sleep for me that night. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, the old coffee mug warm in my hand, the clock ticking steadily. I thought about every sacrifice I had made, every dollar I had saved, every small plan I had built for my old age. And I thought about David's voice, raw with fear, begging me to save him. By the time the sun pushed a faint glow through the blinds, I already knew what I would do. I would go to the bank. I would gather every scrap of security I had left. I would risk everything because he was my son and because I could not turn away while he drowned. The birds outside began to stir, and I sat quietly staring at the pale light spilling into the kitchen. The decision was heavy, almost unbearable, but it had already taken root inside me. The morning came heavy and gray, the kind of Texas morning where the air sits thick before the sun burns it off. I had not slept a minute. My coffee tasted like ash as I sat at the table staring at the checkbook and a stack of old envelopes. By 7, I had already called the bank and asked for an appointment. The woman on the other end of the line told me they could fit me in at 9:30. I thanked her, my voice steady, though my hands were trembling. I dressed in my plain blue dress, the one I used to wear for school conferences when I was still teaching, and drove my aging sedan into downtown Houston. The streets were already buzzing, people rushing with coffees in hand, while I gripped the steering wheel as if it might keep me upright. My stomach twisted with each mile. Inside the bank, the air smelled of polished wood and toner from the printers. A young teller led me to a small office where a woman named Ms. Carter, the loan officer, waited with a polite but curious expression. Beside her sat a man I had asked for by name, Attorney Richard Miller, a friend of a friend who knew real estate law. Mr. Miller greeted me with a warm handshake. He was in his 50s with silver hair at his temples and eyes that seemed to measure every detail. Ms. Carter adjusted her glasses and folded her hands over a neat folder. I explained in as few words as possible. My son is in default on a debt. He owes $68,000. I want to clear it. Ms. Carter blinked and asked if I understood the risk. Mr. Miller leaned forward gently. Mary, this will require liquidating almost everything you own, your retirement, your savings, and likely the sale of your current home. If you do this, you will have very little left for yourself. I nodded. I understand. He is my son. Ms. Carter opened the folder. We can structure this as a refinancing package. Since you are willing to cover the debt, you will be listed as the principal borrower. The lien will be placed on your son's property in Spring Branch. That way the bank has security. She looked at me carefully. Do you want to read through the documents? I looked down at the thick stack of papers. Lines of fine print legal clauses pages that would take hours to fully digest. My throat tightened. I thought of David's panicked voice, the image of my granddaughter Ella's small hands clinging to her father. I picked up the pen. Mr. Miller touched my arm. You do not have to do this, Mary. I met his eyes. I already lost one husband to illness and most of my dreams to bills. I will not watch my son lose his home. My signature scratched across the pages. Each stroke felt like chiseling away a piece of my future, yet I kept moving. By the time I finished, Ms. Carter was nodding. "It will take 2 weeks to process everything. We will liquidate your accounts and finalize the lien. Once complete, the debt will be closed." 2 weeks. The words echoed as I stepped out into the parking lot. The sky had cleared, sunlight pressing hot on the hood of my car. I drove straight to a realtor's office to list my small bungalow for sale. It was worth around $120,000. I signed the paperwork with a dull ache in my chest, remembering the afternoons spent on that porch sewing while the neighborhood kids played. The realtor smiled, telling me the market was hot and it would sell quickly. I nodded but felt no relief. Over the next days, I began boxing up my belongings. Old school books from my teaching years, my husband's tools that I had never thrown away, the quilt my mother had made before she died. Each item carried a weight of memory. I packed them carefully into cardboard boxes, not knowing where they would land. At night, I lay awake, listening to the creaks of the house, the distant hum of the freeway, and wondered if I was doing the right thing. My rational mind screamed that I was being reckless, that a 62-year-old woman should be protecting her future, not burning it away, but my heart refused to let my son drown. 2 weeks later, I returned to the bank. Ms. Carter greeted me with a cashier's check, the numbers stark in black ink. $68,000. I stared at it as if it might vanish, as if it was both a rope and a noose. David was already waiting in the lobby, his eyes bloodshot, his suit rumpled. When he saw me, he rushed forward and hugged me tightly. "Mom, I owe you my life. I owe you everything." I stiffened slightly in his arms, then let myself hold him. We walked together into Ms. Carter's office. I handed over the check. The payment was processed, the debt cleared. Just like that, the burden that had nearly crushed him was lifted. David exhaled so deeply, his whole frame seemed to sag. He turned to me with something like gratitude and relief flooding his features. "You will stay with us now, right, Mom? It is only fair. You have done everything. You should not be alone in that old place." I was too tired to argue. I nodded slowly. Maybe I thought this would be the turning point. Maybe love would finally be met with gratitude. We walked out of the bank together into the bright Houston sun. He opened the car door for me and said, "I will take care of you now." I wanted so badly to believe him. I clutched my purse against my chest, knowing every cent I had ever saved was now gone, poured into his second chance. I climbed into the car, silently praying that I had not just signed away the rest of my life. David's arms wrapped around me so tightly I could barely breathe. His body shook against mine, and I could feel the relief pouring out of him in uneven sobs. He kept saying the same words over and over, that he owed me his life, that he would take care of me forever. I nodded, too exhausted to respond, my heart wanting to believe, but my mind already whispering cautions I could not silence. When we stepped out of the bank into the glare of the Houston sun, Lena was waiting by the car. She smiled, though the edges of it were tight, and kissed my cheek. "You should come stay with us now, Mary. No need to spend money on that little house anymore. It would make sense, and you will have your family around you." Her tone was sweet, but I caught the faint stiffness beneath it. Still, I told myself not to question. My bungalow was already under contract, boxes stacked and waiting. I agreed. "Yes, I will come." The following week, I packed what I could into a few suitcases and a trunk, leaving behind furniture that would be sold with the house. I walked through the empty rooms one last time, pausing in the kitchen where I had spent so many mornings drinking coffee, in the small bedroom where my husband's old dresser still stood, and on the porch where I used to watch neighborhood kids ride bikes. I locked the door with a trembling hand and slid the key into the realtor's envelope. David drove me to his house in Spring Branch, a 2-story brick home with a manicured lawn and a basketball hoop above the garage. Lena greeted me warmly at the door, Ella running up to hug my legs. "Grandma, you are living with us now!" She squealed, her small arms tightening around me. My heart swelled. They had cleared out the guest room upstairs, painted pale yellow with a twin bed neatly made and a small dresser tucked against the wall. It was not large, but it was enough. Lena pointed at the closet. "We made space for you," she said with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. I spent the first evening unpacking slowly, each dress folded carefully into drawers, each photograph placed along the windowsill. My hands lingered on one picture, David in his graduation gown hair, messy under the cap, grinning so wide. I pressed the frame against my chest and whispered a silent prayer that maybe this was the turning point, that maybe my son would finally see me, respect me, and remember the sacrifices that had built his path. Dinner that night was filled with laughter. Ella chattered about school, David told a story about a client at the real estate office, and Lena served chicken casserole with salad. I offered to do the dishes, but Lena shook her head. "You are our guest, now relax." I felt warmth rise in my chest. As the days passed, I tried to fit myself into the rhythm of the house. In the mornings, I walked Ella to the bus stop, and in the afternoons, I folded laundry or prepared simple dinners when Lena worked late. David kissed my cheek on his way out the door, and for the first time in years, I felt useful again. The sharp edges of fear and regret dulled, and I began to think perhaps I had not made a mistake. One evening, while unpacking another box, I came across an old quilt I had sewn decades earlier, each patch stitched during long nights when David was a baby. I spread it across my new bed and sat down tracing the faded fabric. The weight of memory was heavy, but it was comforting too. I thought of all the nights rocking him with that quilt draped across my lap, singing softly into the dark. He was grown now, a husband and a father, but in my heart, he was still that boy. Lena knocked lightly on the door, peeking in. "Need anything, Mary?" Her voice was pleasant, but I noticed her eyes flicker around the room, as if checking how much space I had taken. "No, thank you," I said with a smile. She nodded and pulled the door closed. That weekend, David suggested a family barbecue. We grilled steaks in the backyard, neighbors dropped by, and Ella ran through the sprinkler, her laughter echoing off the fences. For a moment, I let myself believe we were a normal family, that all the tension of the past had washed away with the debt. Later that night, as I lay in bed under the quilt, I heard muffled voices downstairs. Lena's tone was sharp, almost a hiss. She said something about finances, about being careful now that I was living there. David mumbled back, his voice low and hard to catch. I pulled the quilt tighter around me, telling myself it was nothing. The following morning, Lena was all smiles, serving pancakes with strawberries. I decided to push away the unease. People argued marriages had stress. It did not mean anything. I focused instead on Ella, on the way she lit up when I helped her with homework, on the way her small hand fit into mine. She was a reminder of why I had done all of it, why I had emptied my accounts and signed away my future. She was the thread of hope tying me to something larger than my own fears. Still at night, when the house settled and everyone was asleep, I sometimes sat at the window staring at the moonlit lawn. I wondered if gratitude would last, if promises of care would hold, or if the sacrifice I had made was only the beginning of another storm. The picture of David in his graduation gown rested on the nightstand beside me. I touched the frame and whispered to myself that this was a new beginning. I had to believe it. Without that belief, I had nothing left. The first month in David and Lena's house began with a rhythm that felt almost like breathing after holding it too long. Each morning I woke before the others, padding quietly down the stairs in my slippers so I would not disturb them. The kitchen light spilled warm across the counters, and I brewed coffee in the machine Lena preferred, careful not to use my old kettle that had been tucked away in one of the cupboards. I sat at the small table by the window with my mug, watching the street come alive, feeling both grateful and strangely unsettled. Ella was the bright thread that pulled me through each day. At 8 years old, she was endlessly curious, forever asking questions about the birds on the power lines or the shape of clouds. She would sit beside me on the porch steps while we waited for her school bus, swinging her legs and telling me about her spelling tests. When the bus pulled up, she would run up the steps, turn to wave, and shout that she loved me before disappearing inside. Those moments stitched a fragile kind of joy into the fabric of my mornings. Back inside, I busied myself with chores. Folding laundry became a quiet ritual. I stacked David's work shirts carefully pressed and smelling of detergent, and folded Ella's small socks in pairs that reminded me of when I used to do the same for David. I vacuumed the rugs, wiped down the counters, and dusted the shelves. I did it not because they asked, but because it gave me purpose. In the evenings, we gathered around the oak dining table. David often returned late from his office in Midtown, but he still kissed my cheek before sitting down. Sometimes he even complimented the meals I had prepared. The night he thanked me for the pasta and smiled in that easy way, my chest tightened with pride. I thought perhaps he was beginning to see me again, not as a burden, but as the mother who had raised him. Still, the air carried undercurrents I could not ignore. Lena tried at first to be cordial, but soon I began noticing small cracks in her politeness. She sighed audibly when I entered the kitchen, as though my presence crowded her. Once I left a bar of lavender soap in the bathroom. The next morning it was gone, replaced with her own brand. Another time my old kettle disappeared, entirely hidden away somewhere I could not find. These were small things, but they left bruises on my heart. I tried not to let it show. Instead, I focused on Ella. She adored reading bedtime stories with me, curling into my lap as I traced words with my finger along the page. She laughed when I did the voices, and her giggles softened the sharp edges of my worry. At least she wanted me near, but the more comfortable I tried to make myself, the more I sensed Lena tightening. One afternoon, I set cornbread in the oven, the rich scent filling the house. Ella ran in delighted, but Lena followed with a basket of laundry. She sniffed the air and forced a smile. "That smells nice, Mary, but maybe next time let me know before you use the oven. It makes the house hot and I just cleaned." Her words pricked at me, though her tone was even. I nodded and apologized, swallowing my pride. The real wound came late one evening. I was setting plates on the table when I heard Lena's voice in the living room. It was low but sharp, the way a whisper can still cut through. "It is like living with a shadow," she said into the phone. "She is just always there." I froze with the plates in my hands, my pulse thudding in my ears. A shadow. That was what I had become in her eyes. Not a mother who had emptied her savings, not a grandmother who braided Ella's hair before school, but a shadow clinging to the edges of her home. I set the plates down silently and returned to the kitchen, forcing my face to remain neutral when they all sat down to dinner. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the quilt from my old house pulled tight around me. My mind replayed her words again and again. A shadow. I tried to remind myself of the reason I was there, that I had saved them from disaster, that they owed their roof to me. But gratitude seemed to fade quickly in this house. The following morning, David was cheerful, chattering about a property he hoped to sell. He did not notice the way Lena glanced at the crumbs I left near my plate. I reached for Ella's hand beneath the table, letting her small warmth anchor me. Days drifted on. I made myself smaller, quieter, hoping it would ease the tension. I kept my belongings confined to the little yellow room, folded my clothes neatly, and cooked only when asked. But no matter how careful I was, the weight of Lena's disapproval pressed against me like a steady wind. One Saturday, David suggested a barbecue. We grilled steaks in the backyard while neighbors dropped by. Ella ran through the sprinkler, her laughter ringing bright. For a moment, I let myself believe we were a normal family, that the debt and the sacrifices had been worth it. But later that night, as I carried dishes inside, I caught Lena watching me, her smile brittle, her eyes cool. I carried that image with me when I went upstairs. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I studied the photograph of David in his graduation gown. He had been so young, so proud, grinning with his whole face. I pressed the frame to my chest and told myself I had done the right thing, that this unease was temporary, that families adjusted. Yet when I stepped out into the backyard later, the grass damp with dew and the night sky vast above me, I whispered to the dark that I hoped I had not made a mistake. The house behind me was silent, but the sense of not belonging clung to me as surely as the night air. I returned inside, pulled the quilt around me, and tried to will myself into believing that love and gratitude would grow if I just held on long enough. David's birthday crept up quietly, and I decided that if there was ever a time to remind him of the bond we once had, this was it. From the time he was 8 until he left for college, I had made him lasagna on every birthday, layering noodles and sauce with the kind of care that only a mother could. I thought perhaps if I brought back that tradition, we might find our way back to each other. I spent the afternoon in the kitchen, my hands moving with memory rather than sight. I browned the beef stirred in tomatoes and herbs, and let the sauce simmer until the smell filled every corner of the house. Ella wandered in and peeked over the counter, her eyes lighting up. "Grandma, is that lasagna?" Her voice carried a sweetness that eased some of the ache inside me. I smiled and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, your dad's favorite." She skipped away to set the table, humming to herself. By the time the dish came out of the oven, bubbling and golden on top, I felt a flicker of hope. I placed it carefully in the center of the dining table, the same table where I had begun to notice the cracks in our family. Lena brought out a salad and a loaf of bread, her movements efficient, her eyes flicking past me without comment. David arrived late, phone in hand, tie loosened around his neck. He kissed Ella on the head, sat down, and immediately began scrolling. We gathered in silence. I served each plate, setting the lasagna in front of David with a smile I hoped he would return. He did not look up. Ella poked at her food quietly, the sparkle in her earlier excitement dulled by the heavy air. I cleared my throat and asked David about his day. He mumbled something about a client while his eyes stayed glued to the glowing screen in his hand. It was Lena who broke the silence. She put down her fork and folded her hands, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut. "This house feels a little cramped," she said. Maybe it is time we talk about something more long-term. If Mary could find another place even temporarily, I think it would help everyone breathe. Her words landed like a slap. I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth. I turned my eyes to David, searching his face for even the smallest sign of protest, a shake of the head, a simple "that is not fair." Instead, he kept scrolling thumb flicking across the screen as if he had not heard. My heart pounded, waiting for him to speak, but the silence stretched until it pressed against my chest. I forced a smile, though my lips trembled. "Well," I said softly, "I suppose I can look into options." Nobody answered. Lena gave a satisfied little smile and lifted her glass of water. Ella glanced between us, sensing something was wrong, but she stayed quiet, pushing noodles around her plate. The rest of the meal passed in suffocating silence. The lasagna sat heavy in my stomach, no longer tasting of love or tradition, but of betrayal. I stared at the pan in the center of the table, remembering all the birthdays past, when David had blown out candles with laughter in his eyes, when he had hugged me tightly and said thank you for the best meal. Those memories now collided with the man who sat across from me, his attention locked on a screen, his mouth shut, while his wife asked me to leave. After dinner, I excused myself and carried the dishes to the sink. The sound of clinking plates was the only noise in the room. I washed them slowly, hands moving through the warm water, while my chest ached with a hollow kind of grief. Behind me, I heard chairs scrape footsteps, retreating, a door closing upstairs. I was alone with the fading scent of garlic and baked cheese. Later, in the privacy of my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the quilt draped across it. My hands shook as I tried to fold it, the fabric slipping through my fingers. I pressed my face into the cloth and let silent tears soak into the stitches. I thought of the long nights I had worked extra shifts to keep David in school, of the sacrifices I had made without question. All of it, I realized, had led me here to a birthday dinner where my presence was treated as an inconvenience. Ella knocked gently before bed and slipped inside. She climbed onto my lap, resting her head against my shoulder. "Grandma, the lasagna was really good," she whispered. I kissed her hair and held her tighter, the simple words a balm against the wound of the evening. She stayed only a moment before running back to her parents, leaving me in the quiet once more. I turned off the lamp and lay back, staring into the dark. The sound of muffled voices drifted through the wall, Lena's sharper than David's, but I could not make out the words. I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing. For the first time since moving in, I wondered how long I could keep pretending this was a home for me. The memory of the lasagna, once a symbol of love, now twisted in my chest like a knife. I told myself I would think of something that I would find a way to endure. But deep inside, a truth I did not want to face was beginning to take shape, as steady and relentless as the tick of the clock beside my bed. A few weeks passed after that dinner, weeks where I tiptoed through the house trying not to disturb anyone, weeks where I cooked less and spoke less and folded myself into the smallest corners possible. I kept hoping things would shift, that David would come to me one evening and tell me he was sorry for staying silent while his wife pushed me aside. That moment never came. Instead, the distance grew until it was a wall between us. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to walk to the grocery store and pick up a few things. The air was sticky with Houston humidity, and the bags dug into my arms as I trudged back up the driveway. I balanced them on my hip, reached for my key, and slid it into the lock. It did not turn. I frowned, tried again, twisting harder. The key stuck halfway but refused to move. My stomach sank. I pulled it out, rubbed it against my skirt, and tried again. Nothing. I rang the doorbell, the cheerful chime echoing faintly inside, but no one came. I knocked first gently, then harder. Still silence. My palms began to sweat. I pulled out my phone and sent a quick text to David. "The lock is not working. Can someone let me in?" 10 minutes passed, then 20. No reply. I called him. Straight to voicemail. I tried Lena's number. The same. I sat down on the porch steps, the grocery bags beside me, and waited. The sun dipped lower as an hour stretched thin. My back ached from sitting on the wooden steps. The lasagna dish from his birthday dinner sat heavy inside one of the bags, wrapped in foil, still unreturned. Its weight felt symbolic, a reminder of love soured. Finally, headlights cut across the street, sweeping over me. David's car rolled into the driveway, Lena sitting stiffly beside him. Relief surged through me as I stood quickly. He will explain, I told myself. There must be some mistake. David climbed out, eyes widening when he saw me. "Mom, what are you doing here?" My breath caught. What am I doing here? I live here. Or at least I thought I did. Lena stepped out slowly, her heels clicking on the concrete, arms folded tight across her chest. "We changed the locks, Mary. It was for safety." Her tone was even, almost polite, but her eyes held a cold satisfaction. I turned to David, my voice trembling. "You changed the locks without telling me." He shifted uncomfortably, gaze skittering away from mine. "Look, Mom, it is just better this way. Everyone has been stressed. You need your own space. Better this way." I repeated the words back to him, tasting the bitterness in them. "I sold my home. I gave up my savings. I paid off your debt. And you lock me out, like a stranger." He winced but did not argue. "Nobody asked you to do that." He muttered, his voice low. The ground seemed to tell me. Nobody asked. As if my sacrifice was some unwanted gift. As if saving what I knew would be nothing more than an inconvenience. Lena stepped closer, chin lifted. "This is not your house. You cannot stay here." The finality in her voice cut through me. I bent down and picked up the grocery bags, my fingers shaking so badly the paper crinkled. The lasagna pan clinked inside the sound, echoing in the quiet evening. For a second, I thought my knees might give out right there on the porch, but pride forced me to stand tall. I stared at David one last time, searching for the boy who used to run into my arms after baseball practice, the young man who once surprised me with flowers when I earned my driver's license late in life. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man who looked away while his wife erased me. The porch light flickered on as if to illuminate my exile. I stepped back slowly, clutching the bags against my chest. The door closed behind them with a firm click, sealing me out. Neighbors' curtains shifted across the street. I knew they were watching, though no one came over. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and forced my legs to carry me down the sidewalk. At the corner, I stopped, pulled out my phone, and called for a cab. My voice cracked, but I managed to give the address. When the car arrived, I slid into the back seat, setting the groceries on my lap. The driver glanced at me through the mirror. "Rough night, ma'am." I swallowed and nodded, unable to form words. My eyes stayed fixed on the house as it receded behind us, the brick walls glowing warm in the setting sun. It was the house I had saved, the one I had poured my life into, and now it belonged to people who had no room for me. I pressed my hand over the foil-wrapped pan through the bag, almost laughing at the irony. The dish that once represented tradition and love was now nothing more than dead weight in my arms. The cab turned onto the main road, city lights beginning to flicker on in the distance. The hum of the engine filled the silence as tears slipped down my cheeks, quiet and hot. The The driver said nothing more, and for that I was grateful. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the window. The night air outside smelled of cut grass and gasoline. I knew with sudden clarity that whatever came next, I had crossed a line I could not return from. They had not only locked me out of the house, they had locked me out of their lives. The cab carried me away from the house that no longer recognized me, its headlights cutting through the humid Houston night. I pressed my bags against my chest, the lasagna pan rattling inside, and tried not to sob in front of the driver. He said nothing, just glanced at me in the mirror once with quiet concern before focusing on the road. I gave him an address I barely remembered, Cedar Creek Lane, where I had seen a handwritten sign for rooms to rent tacked to a telephone pole near the church. I did not know what waited there, but I needed a roof and 4 walls. When we pulled up to the house, it looked tired, but well kept, a single story with peeling paint and flower pots lining the porch. The driver helped me with the bags, and I stood for a long moment under the dim porch light, gathering courage to knock. My knuckles rapped lightly, and after a pause, the door opened to reveal a woman with white hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. She wore a cardigan despite the heat, and her eyes studied me with gentle curiosity. "You must be here about the room," she said. Her voice carried a warmth that felt like a blanket draped across my shoulders. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. "I am Eileen Carter," she continued. "Been a widow for 10 years now. Rent out the extra rooms to keep the house full. Come in, dear." She led me down a narrow hallway to a small bedroom. The bed was narrow, the dresser missing a handle, but the sheets were clean and the window open to a brick wall that promised privacy. I set down my bags and released a breath I had not known I was holding. Eileen touched my arm. "No rush on the rent tonight. You look like you need rest more than paperwork." That night I lay on the thin mattress listening to the creak of the old house and the distant hum of traffic. I thought about the locked door behind me, about Lena's folded arms and David's averted eyes. My chest burned with grief, but I also felt the faintest flicker of relief. The door had shut, but I was still breathing. The next morning I walked to the church a block away, a red brick building with paint peeling from the trim. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and floor wax. Volunteers bustled about sorting boxes of canned goods. A woman with graying hair and a sturdy frame introduced herself as Dolores. She handed me a stack of soup cans without hesitation, as if I belonged there. Later, a tall man named Kenny cracked jokes while he carried heavy bags of rice. They asked no questions about why I was there. They only gave me work to do, and in that silence I found comfort. Days settled into a rhythm. In the mornings, I walked to the church pantry, tying on an apron and packing bags of groceries for families who lined up outside. In the afternoons, I returned to my small room, boiled tea in a chipped mug Eileen had given me, and stared at the stack of boxes I had carried from my old home. For the first time in weeks, I felt useful again. One evening, restless, I pulled out my worn leather suitcase from under the bed. Inside were the documents I had signed at the bank papers I had barely glanced at before putting pen to page. I spread them across the little desk, the lamp's light pooling over the fine print. My eyes moved slowly, determined to read every word. With each paragraph, my pulse quickened. The borrower's name, Mary Talbot. The secured property, 4112 Wisteria Drive. The house where David and Lena now slept without me. The lien holder, First Texas Savings. My breath caught. I read it again and again, hardly believing. I had not just co-signed. I was the principal borrower. The house was tied to me, not them. They thought I had handed them a gift, but in truth, they had placed their home in my hands. I leaned back in the chair, clutching the edge of the desk to steady myself. The tea beside me had gone cold, but I sipped it anyway, the bitterness sharp on my tongue. My heart pounded not with fear this time, but with something steadier. Power. For weeks I had believed I was powerless, that I had given away everything and been left with nothing. But the truth was written in black ink on these pages. I was not erased. I was not discarded. I still had a claim, a foothold, a rope to pull myself back up. I gathered the papers neatly and slid them back into the folder, my hands steady now. Then I sat in the quiet room, listening to the ceiling fan hum the murmur of Eileen's television downstairs. For the first time since the door shut on me, I slept deeply knowing that I had not lost everything. The next morning when I walked to the church, the sky was clear and the air sharp with the promise of rain. Dolores handed me a basket of bread to distribute. Kenny winked and told a story that made the others laugh. I smiled, but inside, I carried a secret no one else knew. They thought they had locked me out forever. They thought I had nothing left. But I had read the fine print, and the fine print remembered what people tried to forget. The following week, I was sweeping the walkway outside Eileen's house when her neighbor Tom ambled over with the community newspaper tucked under his arm. He was the sort of man who thrived on small-town news, even though Houston sprawled too wide to ever feel small. He tipped his cap and grinned. "Mary, you seen this?" I brushed hair from my eyes and shook my head. He unfolded the paper, flattening it against his palm, and jabbed a finger at a photo printed near the bottom corner. My stomach lurched. There they were, David and Lena, standing in front of a vacant brick storefront downtown, with their arms looped together, beaming as if they had conquered the world. The headline above them read, "Local couple to open dream cafe in Houston's theater district." Tom chuckled, oblivious to the weight pressing against my ribs. "Looks like your boy is making something of himself. Going to be a real businessman. Must make you proud." I forced a smile and nodded, murmuring something polite before excusing myself. My hands trembled as I carried the paper into my room. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at their grins, Lena tilting her head toward the camera like she already owned the city. My chest tightened as I read the words beneath the photograph. Funding for the cafe will come from the sale of their family home in Spring Branch. Family home. The phrase nearly choked me. I whispered it aloud, bitter as bile. They were selling what I had saved, trading my sacrifice for their dream. I folded the paper carefully, smoothed the creases, and slid it into the drawer with the loan documents. That night I barely slept. My mind spun with images of David pouring coffee behind a shiny counter while I sat forgotten in a rented room. Weeks passed, each one carrying the same routine of volunteering at the church pantry and sipping tea alone at night. Dolores teased me about working too hard. Kenny tried to coax me into laughing at his jokes. I played along, but under the surface I carried the secret, the knowledge that the deed was tied to me. I waited, certain that sooner or later the phone would ring. It was a humid Thursday afternoon when it finally did. I glanced at the screen and saw David's number glowing back. My heart skipped, then steadied. I let it ring once longer before answering. His voice was rushed, panicked. "Mom, thank God you picked up. We have a problem. The bank will not process the house sale. They said they need your signature. Apparently you are listed as the primary on the lien." I let the silence stretch, listening to his uneven breathing. Finally, I said quietly, "Why would you need me, David? I thought I was nothing to you." He stumbled. "It is just a technical thing, Mom. Just paperwork. If you sign, everything will be fine. We need this cafe. It is our future." In the background, I heard Lena's muffled voice sharp instructing him to convince me. My lips curled into a smile he could not see. I asked again, "Why would you need me if I am just a burden, a shadow? You made it very clear I did not belong." He swallowed hard. "Mom, I was angry. I did not mean it. Please, this is urgent. The buyers are ready. We just need your help." I looked around my small rented room at the chipped dresser and the quilt folded neatly on the bed. Humble though it was mine, more mine than the house they claimed as theirs. My voice came out steady. "I cannot help you." "Not this time." "But Mom," he pleaded, his voice cracking, "if you do not sign, the sale falls through. We have invested everything." I closed my eyes and pictured Lena's satisfied smile the night she told me I did not belong, David standing mute beside her. My fingers tightened on the phone. "You should have thought of that before you shut the door on me," I said. Then I pressed the red button and ended the call. The phone buzzed again almost instantly. I set it face down on the desk. The vibration rattled against the wood until it finally stopped. When it began again minutes later, I ignored it. I poured myself a cup of tea, carried it to the window, and stared at the alley beyond the glass. I could still hear his voice in my head, frantic, begging. For years I had jumped each time he called, rushing to fix what he broke, giving without hesitation. Now I felt a new steadiness in my chest, a rhythm that told me I no longer had to bow. The phone lit up late into the night, messages piling up. I did not read them. I let the silence speak louder than I ever could. As I sipped the last of my tea, cold and bitter, I whispered to myself that this time I would not be erased. They might have dreams of a cafe with shiny countertops and downtown customers, but the foundation of those dreams was built on my name, my signature, my sacrifice. Without me, they had nothing solid. The clock ticked toward midnight, the room dim and still. I gathered the loan documents, laid them on the desk, and smoothed the pages with both hands. My reflection stared back from the window pane, older lined but no longer broken. I was not powerless. I had the final word. 2 days slipped by after I ended that call, and the silence from David was louder than any argument. I kept my phone face down on the dresser, afraid that if I saw his name again, I might waver. The church pantry kept me busy sorting bags of rice and cans of beans alongside Dolores and Kenny, but each night when I returned to my room, the quiet pressed in on me. I would boil water, sip tea, and remind myself that the power was finally in my hands. Late one afternoon, as the sun stretched long shadows across Cedar Creek Lane, a knock rattled my door. It was softer than I expected, hesitant, almost apologetic. I set my mug aside and opened it to find David and Lena standing on the porch. David's shoulders slumped, his hands buried in his pockets. Lena's eyes were swollen, red-rimmed, her mascara smeared from crying. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then she whispered, "Hi, Mary. Can we come in?" I stepped back without a word. They entered my small rented room looking wildly out of place. The narrow bed, the chipped dresser, the single chair beside the desk, all of it seemed to shrink them. I pulled over another chair from the corner and gestured for them to sit. They perched uneasily, their knees close to the table, their backs stiff. Lena was the first to speak. Her voice cracked like glass. "We were wrong. All of it. We should not have said the things we did. We should not have locked you out. Please, the bank will not let us finalize the sale without your signature. Everything depends on this." David stayed quiet, his head bowed as if he could not meet my eyes. The silence was louder than her pleading. I reached down to the floor and pulled out the old leather folder that had not left my side. I placed it carefully on the table, the weight of it settling like a stone between us. With deliberate hands, I opened it and spread the documents one by one. This, I said, is the loan agreement. Look closely. The borrower's name is mine, not yours. Lena leaned forward, her lips moving as she read the lines. Her face blanched, the color draining away. David shifted in his chair, his jaw tight, but still he said nothing. I slid another paper across the table. This is the mortgage deed, and here the lien confirmation from the bank. The property at Wisteria Drive is secured under my name. Lena pressed her hand against her mouth, her breath shaky. That cannot be, she whispered. It can, I answered. And it is. You thought I was simply handing over cash, but you never noticed that the house itself was tied to me. Their eyes followed as I reached into the folder again and pulled out a final sheet of paper freshly typed and notarized. I laid it in front of them. This is a repayment demand. $85,000. Principal and interest. The room went still. Outside, a car drove past, music faint through its windows, but in the room there was only the sound of breathing. Lena's tears spilled over, streaking down her cheeks. David's shoulders hunched further, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened. I leaned back, my voice calm, though my heart thundered. If you want your house free, you will repay me. Every cent. Lena's voice broke, rising almost to a wail. We do not have that kind of money. We have already invested everything in the cafe. The equipment, the lease, the furniture, it is all gone. Please, Mary, if we lose the house, we lose everything. I met her eyes steadily. Then you should have thought of that before you locked me out. David finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were wet. His lips trembled. I am sorry, Mom, he whispered. I should never have said what I did. I should never have let this happen. For a moment, my chest ached with the memory of the boy. He had once been the boy who made me handmade cards on Mother's Day, the boy who once stood at the edge of a soccer field searching for my face in the crowd. But the man before me had turned those memories sour. This is not revenge, I said, my voice firm. This is justice. You cannot erase me and still expect my help. Choices have weight, and now you are carrying yours. Lena reached across the table, her fingers trembling. Mary, please. We are family. Family, I repeated softly. Family does not shut the door in your face. Family does not call you a burden. I gathered the documents into a neat stack, sliding the repayment demand to the top. Until you pay what is owed, the house remains mine. That is the truth written here, and no tears will erase it. They sat in silence, broken and small in the dim light of my little room. I stood, walked to the dresser, and placed the folder on top, resting my hand over it, as if to anchor myself. My heart no longer pounded with panic. It beat steady, strong. David rose first, his movement slow. He looked at me one last time, but found no words. Lena followed, her sobs muffled into her sleeve. They shuffled toward the door, their footsteps heavy on the worn linoleum. I did not stop them. I let the door close quietly behind their retreating forms. The room felt larger once they were gone, the air easier to breathe. I returned to the table, lifted my mug, and took a sip of tea that had long since gone cold. The bitterness lingered on my tongue, but this time it did not sting. It tasted like boundaries I should have drawn years ago. David's lips trembled as though he wanted to argue, but no words came. He only nodded almost imperceptibly, then rose from the chair and guided Lena toward the door. They left my little room in silence, the sound of their retreating footsteps on the old wooden stairs lingering longer than their visit. When the door closed, I sat back down at the table, slid the folder of documents into place, and let out a slow breath. I had set the boundary. Now it was theirs to face. The days that followed were marked by a strange stillness. David texted twice short, desperate messages, asking if I would reconsider, but I did not respond. Instead, I folded laundry, brewed tea, and spent hours at the church pantry helping Dolores and Kenny. They never pressed for details, though Dolores would sometimes pat my shoulder as if she could sense the storm that hovered around me. By the second week, David called, his voice raw with exhaustion. "Please, Mom, just give us more time." I could hear Lena crying faintly in the background. I steadied my tone even as my chest ached. 30 days. That is all I can allow. 30 days, not one more. When I hung up, I sat by the window watching the cars drift past on Cedar Creek Lane. The number rolled around in my mind like a clock ticking 30. I knew each day would bring them closer to the edge. And each day would remind me that promises once broken have a price. In those weeks, I learned through Tom and other neighbors that David was scrambling. He had driven across Houston, meeting with old friends, asking for loans, even approaching extended relatives we had not spoken to in years. Lena had gone to her parents' home in Katy, hoping they might front the money, but they refused. Their pride was slipping thread by thread. I imagined them at night whispering over bills, the dream of their cafe turning into a nightmare they could not wake from. Meanwhile, my own life took on a strange calm. Each morning I walked to the church tied on my apron and worked alongside volunteers. Kenny joked about my neat handwriting when I labeled boxes. Dolores teased that I made soup better than the men, and Eileen sometimes left cookies on the counter for me when I came home. My world had shrunk to a single room and a few kind faces, but it felt steadier than the grand house where I had been unwanted. On the 29th day, David's name flashed across my phone again. His voice cracked with desperation. "Mom, please. We are trying. We have nothing left. Can you just give us a little more time?" I closed my eyes, the weight of his plea sinking into me. But then I remembered the locked door, the cold night, the lasagna pan clinking in my bag as I stood shut out of the home I had saved. My answer came firm. No. 30 days was what you had. And now the time is done. The following morning, I dressed in my best blouse and skirt garments I had not worn since before everything fell apart. I carried the folder of documents to the office of Miller and Grant, attorneys at law. Mr. Miller rose from behind his oak desk, his silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Are you certain, Mrs. Talbot?" His voice was calm, steady, respectful. I placed the folder on his desk, my hand pressing it flat. "I am certain." He nodded, flipped through the pages, and with deliberate care stamped the petition. Then he looked up. "The court will approve this quickly. You are within every right." True to his word, within 2 weeks the order was signed. The house on Wisteria Drive, once their fortress and my sacrifice, was scheduled for foreclosure. Notices were delivered. Deadlines came and went. David did not call again. The day itself dawned bright, the Texas sun blazing over the neat lawns of Spring Branch. Trucks rolled onto Wisteria Drive, men in uniforms stepping out with clipboards. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, some whispering, others bold enough to stand on porches. Tom told me later how it unfolded. He said Lena collapsed on the lawn, her cries piercing mascara streaking down her cheeks as movers carried out boxes. He said David stood beside her, rigid, holding the house keys in his palm, turning them over and over, though they were nothing more than scraps of metal now. Neighbors murmured to each other. Some pitied, some judged, most simply watched. The movers worked efficiently, carrying furniture down the porch steps, stacking boxes onto the truck bed. The couch where I had once read to Ella was hoisted away, the dining table where I had served lasagna dragged across the lawn. Piece by piece, the life they had claimed unraveled in front of curious eyes. Tom admitted he stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head. He remembered the day he had seen me with grocery bags shut out, and said later he wished he had come over then. Perhaps it would not have changed the outcome, but maybe it would have reminded David and Lena what community meant. By early afternoon, the house was stripped bare. The movers shut the truck doors, handed papers to the bank representative, and left. The lawn was scattered with bits of packing tape and scraps of cardboard. David and Lena sat in the grass, hollow-eyed, staring at the home that was no longer theirs. I was not there. I was at the church in the back room sipping tea from a chipped mug, while Dolores stirred soup and Kenny teased her about adding too much salt. The radio hummed faintly, a gospel station that filled the air with calm. I lifted the mug to my lips, steady hands, steady breath, and let the warmth flow through me. Justice did not require me to watch them fall. Justice had already spoken, written in ink and sealed with law. I had given 30 days, no more. They had chosen silence and cruelty, and now they bore the cost. When I left the church that evening, the sky stretched wide and purple streaked with orange where the sun dipped low. I walked slowly back to Cedar Creek Lane, my shoes tapping against the pavement. In my small rented room, I placed the folder back on the dresser and sat quietly by the window. The bells from the church tower drifted through the night air, calm and solemn. I wrapped my quilt tighter around me and exhaled. The house that had once been my undoing was no longer theirs. The story had shifted, and though it was not triumph, I felt it was something steadier. It was clarity. The first winter after everything ended carried a silence I had never known before. Houston bustled as always, cars crowding the highway's lights glowing across the skyline, but my world had grown small and deliberate. Each morning I walked from Cedar Creek Lane to the church pantry, the familiar creak of the wooden doors greeting me like an old friend. Dolores would already be there tying her apron tight, and Kenny would be stacking boxes with exaggerated groans that made us laugh despite ourselves. It was there, surrounded by soup cans and second-hand coats, that I began to stitch myself back together. The grief of losing my son's house, the betrayal of being cast aside, did not vanish overnight. It clung to me like the scent of smoke after a fire. Yet as weeks turned into months, I learned to carry it differently. The ache no longer crushed me. It simply reminded me of what I had survived. By the fall of 2019, I had saved enough from the foreclosure proceeds and what little I had left of my pension to dare something bold. One afternoon, I sat at Eileen's kitchen table staring at a real estate flyer she had tucked into my hand. Land for sale near Amarillo, the paper read. Acres of sky, a place where no one could shut me out. The thought settled deep inside me. I wanted soil that belonged only to me, a place where my name would not be erased. By December, I signed the deed for a modest lot on the edge of Amarillo, nothing but dirt and horizon, but it was mine. The years that followed passed like chapters in a quiet book. 2020 brought uncertainty to the whole world, but in my small circle the rhythm was steady. I volunteered 3 days a week, sorted clothes for families who had lost jobs, and ladled soup for strangers who sometimes cried as they ate. Dolores became more than a friend. She was my anchor. Kenny taught me to laugh again, his booming voice filling even the darkest corners of the pantry. In 2021, I took the long bus ride north to Amarillo to see the land for the first time. The sky there stretched endlessly, so wide it made me dizzy. Standing on that raw soil, I pressed my shoes into the dust and whispered, "This is where I begin again." Nothing yet stood there but a small wooden stake, marking boundaries, and a scrap of ribbon fluttering in the wind, yet I could see it in my mind: a porch, a kitchen window, a quilt folded at the foot of a bed. Construction moved slowly. The pandemic delayed supplies, storms flooded fields, but little by little progress came. By 2023, concrete was poured and beams rose against the sky. I returned each season, suitcase in hand, watching walls climb upward where there had been only air. Workers waved when they saw me, calling out that my house would be ready before long. I smiled back, though tears often blurred the view. Meanwhile, Houston kept me grounded. Each Sunday after service, Dolores would press a plate of cookies into my hands and say, "You need sweetness, Mary." Kenny teased that I had become the pantry's heart, always steady, always kind. Eileen still rented me the small room on Cedar Creek Lane, and we spent evenings on her porch watching cicadas hum in the trees. I was no longer the woman left sobbing outside a locked door. I was a woman moving forward one brick at a time. By early 2025, the house stood finished. White siding gleamed under the sun, a modest porch stretched wide enough for 2 rocking chairs, and a narrow path led to the door. Out front, a sign had been planted in the soil bold black letters reading, "Future Home of Mary Talbot, Esther 2025. I pressed my hand against the wood, feeling the vibration of the wind, and for the first time in years, I let myself smile freely. The day I received the keys, I walked through every room, my footsteps echoing across the empty hardwood. The kitchen smelled of fresh paint, sunlight streaming across new counters. I lingered by the bedroom window where the horizon stretched limitless and forgiving. I whispered a quiet thank you to God, to the earth beneath me, to the stubborn will that had carried me this far. This was not a house built on someone else's promise. It was built on mine. Roses went into the soil, that spring red and white, blooming against the porch rails. Dolores and Kenny drove up to see the place, bringing jars of peaches and a bouquet of wildflowers. We sat on the porch together, rocking gently, laughter rising into the open sky. Eileen mailed me a letter written in her careful script, saying she was proud of me. My family was smaller now, stitched from friends rather than blood, but it was real, and it was mine. One evening, as cicadas buzzed in the trees, my phone vibrated on the porch table. The number was unfamiliar. When I answered, a small voice whispered, "Grandma, it is me, Ella." My heart clenched. She spoke quickly, as if afraid of being overheard. "I miss you. I think about you every day." I closed my eyes, tears slipping down my cheeks. "I am always here, sweetheart," I told her. "Always. You are never without me." There was a pause, the sound of her small breath trembling. "I love you, Grandma." The words cracked my heart wide open. "I love you too, Ella, more than you will ever know." When the call ended, I stayed on the porch as the sun melted into the horizon. I reached inside my pocket and pulled out the worn photograph of David as a boy, gap-toothed and beaming, arms wrapped around my waist, at a county fair long ago. I traced the edges of the photo not with bitterness anymore, but with a gentle release. The child in that picture would always be mine, even if the man he became no longer was. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of roses across the yard. Behind me, the house stood strong and silent, a monument to everything I had endured and everything I had rebuilt. Ahead stretched the wide Amarillo sky, endless and bright, promising that the story was not over, but beginning again. The drawer slid shut with a soft click, and I sat still for a long while, listening to the hum of the Texas evening drifting in through the open window. The cicadas were loud, their steady rhythm filling the silence in my chest that had once been grief, but now felt more like release. For years I had lived carrying everyone else's weight, shrinking myself to keep the peace breaking my back, to hold up a house that was never really mine. And yet here I was standing in a space where every nail, every board, every inch of soil spoke my name. I rose from the chair and walked slowly through the house, the one I had dreamed into being. My fingers brushed the cool paint of the hallway, the polished surface of the kitchen counters, the edges of windows that opened to the wide Amarillo sky. This was not a mansion, not even large by ordinary standards, but it was honest. It was a home built from the ashes of betrayal, not to erase the past, but to honor the lesson it left behind. In the living room, I paused by the mantel where I had set a few photographs. One of my parents who had worked their whole lives and still managed to smile. One of Ella when she was 5, holding a sparkler on the 4th of July, her grin missing a front tooth. And tucked in the corner, the picture of David at 8 years old, with frosting on his nose from a birthday cake. My chest tightened, but the pain no longer cut like a blade. It was softer now, a bruise instead of a wound. I sat down with a notebook and pen, something I had started doing after the foreclosure. At first the pages were filled with bitterness, every line etched with anger at what had been taken from me. Over time the words shifted. They became prayers lists of small gratitudes, reminders that dignity was not something others handed you, but something you held tightly yourself. Tonight I wrote simply, "I am home." The night deepened. I stepped onto the porch and sank into the rocking chair I had found at a thrift store. The roses I had planted leaned toward the glow of the porch light, their scent carried on the warm breeze. For a moment I closed my eyes and let myself remember the worst nights. The grocery bags digging into my arms, the cold sting of being told I was nothing, the slam of a door that should have opened. Each memory rose like smoke, but instead of choking me, it drifted harmlessly into the night. "I am not that woman anymore," I whispered to myself. "I am not the mother begging at the threshold. I am not the shadow they resented. I am not the sacrifice they pretended never happened. I am the woman who read every line of the papers, who stood firm when they demanded more, who let the law speak for the dignity they tried to bury. The lesson was simple but hard-earned. Love without respect corrodes. Sacrifice without gratitude destroys. If you give until you are empty, those who only take will not stop. They will simply watch as you disappear." I thought again of Ella's voice in the hallway and secret call that she told me she missed me. That was enough to remind me that not all ties had been severed, that sometimes innocence carried more truth than pride ever could. Someday she would understand why I chose not to bend again, why I let the foreclosure happen, why I walked away instead of paying twice for the same mistake. And when that day came, I wanted her to remember my voice not as bitter, but as steady. I rocked gently, letting the chair creak beneath me, and watched the horizon fade into stars. The air smelled of soil and roses, and something else, something like freedom. My house stood behind me, small but sturdy, and in that moment I realized it was more than walls. It was proof. Proof that I could be left for dead in someone else's story and still write my own ending. proof that justice does not always roar. Sometimes it speaks quietly through signatures and seals, and the steady hand that refuses to sign away dignity. If you have ever been cast aside, I would tell you this: paper remembers, the law remembers, and most of all, your worth remembers. Do not beg those who shut the door to open it again. Do not pay twice for the same lesson. Hold fast to the truth of what you gave and let those who mocked it face the silence of losing it. The stars spread wider across the Amarillo sky, and I leaned back with a peace I had not known in years. Tomorrow I would plant more roses. I would invite Dolores and Kenny to visit, maybe even bake a pie to share. Life was not about what I had lost anymore. It was about what I had built. I turned toward the door, ready to step back into the glow of my new home, but paused once more at the edge of the porch. My voice was quiet, almost carried away by the wind. I am not the woman they discarded. I am not the victim they imagined. I am the lesson, and lessons once learned do not fade. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. If it touched something inside you, share your thoughts, tell your own stories, and remember you are not alone here. Stay listen and let your voice join ours, because every story matters, and sometimes the quietest ones carry the deepest truth.